Let's get a word on the big stories of the day. Paul Embery, writer, trade unionist, author of Despised, Why the Modern Left Loathes the Working Classes. Paul, good afternoon to you, sir.
Hi Ian, good to be with you.
Nice to have you with us again. We haven't spoken for some time. Can I just check, you're still a firefighter, or have you legged it?
No, I haven't quite legged it yet. I've still got a couple of years left in me. I'm still out there doing the job just about.
I'm glad to hear it. Yeah, nothing will remove a man from his ladder, as they say. Good to have you with us, Paul. I mean, let's start, by the way, because you know a thing or two about, trade unions. That's well and truly your area of expertise, and we've got a trade union sort of in the doctors' strike, who are clearly now taking it to a level where I sense public support is somewhat waning on this one. Now, everybody wants people to be paid a fair whack for a fair day's pay, and we understand it if you've been restrained for many years that you'd like to try and kind of restore it to what it should be. But what's your overarching take on striking doctors, Paul?
Well, I mean, I've been on strike as a firefighter, Ian, and it's an agonising decision when you work in an emergency service or an essential service to feel that you have to withdraw your labour to make a point. And it's not something that I ever did lightly. It's not something that any firefighter I ever worked with did lightly. I'm pretty sure it's not something that the resident doctors are doing lightly. But when you consider, I think they have a fairly strong argument. When you consider that they've lost something in the region of 20% of their pay in real terms over the last 17 years. At the same time, their workloads have increased. At the same time, NHS waiting lists have increased quite dramatically. Yeah. So they're being asked to do what is a really important and critical job for, in real terms, much less pay. Now, I don't think they're going to get that pay restored. I think they probably know they're not going to get that pay restored in full. But I think it's a bargaining tactic. And what they're saying is, look, what's been put on the table is not good enough. We want something more. We deserve something more. And I think they probably do, actually.
I did kind of wonder. I mean, the BMA seemed very entrenched in their position on this. And I know Wes Streeting has looked at other ways of dealing with it. I was reading the comparisons between, similar types of countries like Australia, for example, where doctors are paid more than they are over here, but their pension is not quite as generous. And I know that's an area that often comes up in a negotiation. I'm sure you've found it in your world as well. Let's have a look at the pension rather than the wage. I mean, that seems fairly reasonable.
Well, I think, look, I mean, all these things are a negotiation. We've been involved in disputes in the fire service where the government has come for the pension. And what people often don't understand is although we were always criticised in the fire service and other public sector workers were for having what people call generous pensions, but of course you have to pay into those pensions in order to get. I mean, I for example, as a firefighter, pay something like 13% of my salary into my pension scheme, which is far more than most people pay. So you're only kind of getting what you pay for. But look, I think the BMA are open for negotiation. Now, I think if a reasonable deal was put on the table, I think they'd probably recommend it to our members, to their members. You don't get something like 90%, I think it was, of doctors voted yes in the ballot for this action. You don't get that in an emergency service unless the people feel genuinely that they've got a legitimate grievance. And I think in this case, as I say, I think they do.
We will watch with interest. There's 5 days of this to come. And of course, the knock-on effect and the devastation. I know that's sort of part of industrial action that you make a point. But, it's in a very delicate and sensitive area. Wes Streeting doesn't seem to be moving at the moment, but we'll have full updates as we know more. Let's go to this story, Paul. The asylum seekers spotted shoplifting designer gear, and part of me wants to sort of, I don't want to laugh at this, but I know we often talk about asylum seekers and what's happening with channel crossings, and it's clearly out of control. The government have lost control. The last government lost control. Nobody is really calling this out or doing anything serious about it. We often talk about that. We often talk about shoplifting as well. And here's a story where both of them come together. I mean, you can't make this stuff up.
Well, the whole thing is a complete shambles. Let's be blunt about it. And I think when it comes to what is very clearly the broken immigration and asylum system, you can kind of feel the tension in the air at the moment around the country. Now, I know some people have kind of used the word tinderbox or powder keg. I don't necessarily think we're at that stage. I hope we're not at that stage. But I sense, Ian, that it would take maybe one or two high-profile incidents, God forbid a terror attack or something like that, where we genuinely could be at that stage. And I just think there's a lot of kind of underlying resentment in many of our communities, many of our unheard of communities. People who feel they've been abandoned and disregarded by the political establishment in this country for so many years, and they're kind of finding their voice now. And I think you can sense a bit of a storm brewing. These are communities that are worried about economic insecurity, they're worried about the levels of immigration, integration problems, lawlessness on the streets, and so on. And stories like this, the one that you're referring to, is almost like the perfect storm, because it highlights the broken immigration and asylum system and the lawlessness. And for as long as these kind of things keep happening, I think that resentment is going to get stronger and stronger, and may break out in some way that none of us are going to like.
Yeah, and I'm fascinated by the sort of class thing on this, or the political element which feeds into class on this, where it's kind of often sort of written off, certainly by a lot of sneering politicians I sense in this particular government, as a kind of right wing, you know, all a bunch of mad right wingers if you've got a problem with, you know, this, that and the other. Well, I mean, you could just come at it, as we discussed yesterday, from an economic perspective and, you know, forget what you think of the colour of someone's skin, where they came from, whatever their disposition might be. You could just say, well, hang on, it's costing us £7-8 million a day. We're taxpayers. Sorry, that can't go on. You don't have to be a nutty right-winger or some extremist or a radicalised kind of half-wit to have a problem with it. And years ago, when I was a kid, growing up in a similar background to you, Paul, I think this would have been a concern that was very much a left-wing concern.
Well, indeed, and as you know, Ian, I've been an activist in the Labour movement for around 30 years, and you know, there was a time when regulation of the labour supply was a core left-wing principle. People on the left, trade union leaders, Labour members of Parliament, knew that you had to control the labour supply so as to allow governments to plan around things like employment levels and welfare, and to make sure there wasn't undue pressure on wages in certain sectors, to make sure there was enough housing and so on. That was an entirely sensible and mainstream view. And actually, the other view of open borders was very much a fringe position on the left, you know, 20, 30 years ago, where it was largely the preserve of Trotskyists and anarchists and hyper-liberals. Now that's turned around completely, and actually the open borders, the sort of hyper-liberal immigration position, has become the mainstream position. And saying actually we should have regulation of the labour supply, people like I say that, you're almost regarded as museum pieces in the labour movement. And all the things that we're seeing, these tensions, not just in terms of the economic factors, but the social and cultural tensions, where you have large numbers of people suddenly arriving in working class communities. I saw it in the place where I grew up in Dagenham, the real tensions that can cause, tensions not born of racism or xenophobia, but simply because people's sense of order had been violated. And you see that now crossing into towns like Epping and Diss in Norfolk. And I still think, Ian, that large parts of the political establishment still don't get it. You can see that in some of the pronouncements that we see when they give interviews.
Yeah, and even when, you know, I watch Yvette Cooper sort of, you know, attempt to sound tough, and you know what it's like when you see politicians, you think it's not, you know, you can say the words, you can try and sort of add some depth and gravitas to your delivery at the dispatch box, but if it's not in their DNA, you just know that they don't really feel it. They don't feel it, that's for sure, and therefore probably don't really mean it.
Well, I mean, I've got this theory that the vast majority of politicians, sooner or later, of whatever political party, they in the end, they all seek the metropolitan embrace. They all seek kudos from their peers. They want to be welcome at dinner parties in North London with other members of Parliament and influential people and people who run our cultural and creative institutions, our academic, educational institutions, and so on. And that's why you see people who may start off with a particular line, who may argue the traditional line on immigration or family, you know, all of the touchstone small c conservative issues. But eventually a lot of them will feel the pull of the progressive and managerial class, and will, you know, fall into the trap of going across essentially to that class because they feel that they want to be part of it. Because, of course, that is the dominant class when it comes to the upper echelons of our society. And that's why I think, you make the point yourself, when politicians say these things, they don't really mean it. And that's why I think if there is to be any change, it's got to come from below. It will come through protests on the streets, which I hope are peaceful. And certainly should be peaceful, but nonetheless, it's only through those protests, a bit like Brexit, when people, ordinary people, do something that the politicians really don't want them to do and really goes against their whole worldview, it's only then that they're forced to act. And I think it's going to be something similar when it comes to these issues.
And it's interesting, you can kind of see it with Starmer. There was a lot of it with Blair. Blair was, as always said, Blair was, at his happiest when he was sitting at a dinner party with Bill Gates, not when he was sitting with David Blunkett or somebody. And similarly with Starmer, you get the sort of Justin Trudeau characters of this world, the Macrons. They seem to love that international backslapping powwows that they get together for. That really suits them. I see our own Prime Minister looking most comfortable in that environment than I do in his own domestic one, which kind of feeds into what you were just saying.
I think with any Labour leader, I think you need the ability to be able to go into a working men's club in somewhere like Stoke-on-Trent and not look and sound completely out of place.
100%.
Now, with Blair, and you're right, he did like the other type of company, but I think he probably could do that. And I think that there are other Labour leaders, Neil Kinnock, for example, John Smith, who also could do it. I think then when you look at someone like Ed Miliband, who couldn't do it, Jeremy Corbyn couldn't do it, I don't think Keir Starmer can do it. Now, I think Keir Starmer has got people behind him saying, look, you've really got to concentrate on some of these themes around family and community and patriotism and tackling law and order and immigration and so on. But I don't think Starmer is there instinctively. I don't think that's his politics. And I think that most people in red wall constituencies, for example, also think that. They also think the Labour leadership is not doing this instinctively. And that's why they're throwing their lot in, with Reform UK, a party that I don't personally support, but you can see why they're sweeping up so many votes.
And that's interesting, isn't it? Because this bit really fascinates me, where you've got Keir Starmer. I don't know if you've ever heard the news on the street, by the way, Paul. He was the son of a toolmaker, apparently. Who knew? Big revelation. I just dug that little fact out this morning. So he grew up, he ended up as a middle-class upbringing, but he did initially, there was a moment, a little window, when they were a sort of working-class family. Nigel Farage, very much the antitheses of that. He grew up private educated, worked in the financial market, did very well in that. So one's a posh boy, one's a working class boy, and yet you could stick Nigel Farage in a housing estate to have a cigarette and a pint of beer, but you couldn't put Keir Starmer in there. So is it therefore just down sometimes to personality and not reality?
I think also it's certainly partly that, but I think in Starmer's defence, it's also because Farage hasn't yet been properly tested.
True.
And it could be that if Farage, and I don't rule it out, if Farage becomes the Prime Minister after the next election, and still we don't get growth in the economy, and still we don't get immigration numbers down and NHS waiting lists down and deal with the housing crisis, then I think actually his star will probably will shine a bit less than it is at the moment.
Yep.
So Farage has never been tested in that way, but certainly he's able to connect because he speaks the language, at least, of many of these people.
100%.
He says, look, we've got woke institutions. I'm not going to allow that if reform comes to government. I'm not going to allow a situation where you've got massive immigration levels that are affecting your community, where, we're not able to stop the boats and so on, and where there's a whole kind of worldview at the top of society that contradicts yours and millions of other people, ordinary working class people like you. He gives that message and it resonates, and I think that's why he's picking up so many votes.
Just a final one here, Paul, right into your industry on this one. The hero firefighter facing disciplinary action for using the term fireman, sparking debates about sexism and woke madness. I mean, I am surprised, I'm not surprised. What do you make of this? I mean, I know it's a firefighter these days, but to some degree, interchangeable, isn't it?
Well, I just think we need to be sensible about this. I mean, you're right, it is firefighter, and it's been firefighter for many years now. I mean, we've had women in the fire service, quite rightly. I've worked with many women firefighters. They've been excellent, most of them, since the early 1980s. So you can see why a woman would be a bit upset if exclusively the term fireman was used. So
Yeah.
technically it's firefighter, just as it's police officer and not policeman anymore. But the point is that occasionally people slip. And they don't do it out of malice. They don't do it because they want to cause offence. They do it, in this case, because that's a term that's been used for over 100 years. And I just think a sensible word in the ear, look, we don't use that term anymore because it's firefighter. That's all it takes for someone to find themselves on a discipline charge because of it. I think is complete overreach. So he has my sympathy.
And we must remember that Lincolnshire, a few years ago, axed Fireman Sam as a mascot because apparently Fireman Sam was seen too much as a kind of gender stereotype. I would have thought Fireman Sam probably accelerated recruitment for the fire service. Or was it London's burning? One of the two.
Probably both, actually. But again, just an example of of overreach. The idea that this kid's cartoon character, who's been around almost since I was a kid, I think, everybody can associate with. The idea that you should ban it inside a fire service simply because you think it's going to cause offence, I think is kind of an indictment of how we've become, such an offence-taking society. Not ordinary people. I don't think most people do take offence at stuff like that, but it's almost done vicariously by people in positions of leadership who think they have to protect the ears of people further down the chain, and it's nonsense and it's insult.
And frankly, Lincolnshire need to get with the script, Paul, because Fireman Sam has been experiencing some transitional issues. Now Fireman Pam, apparently. So I think we should all encourage Pam into the new world. Maybe back as a mascot, who knows. Paul, great to have you with us and lovely to see you again. Thank you. Paul Embery. He is, of course, writer, trade unionist, author of Despise Why the Modern Left Loathes the Working Class, and he's still, on top of all of that, a fully employed firefighter as well. Thank you to him. Or is he a fireman?